One day in April, an airman said to me quite casually, "I suppose you've seen the signal about your old friend Wing Commander Warburton?" To begin with, I was not unduly worried. He had been missing before, and anyway, nothing could ever happen to Warby. All sorts of rumours began to run around. Warby had been shot down. No, Warby had crashed in the Alps. He could come walking in tomorrow, and I don't think I should be a bit surprised.
For 60 years, no one would know for sure what happened to Adrian Warburton. During his time on Malta, he'd been rated as the most valuable pilot in the RAF, often referred to as the Lawrence of Arabia of the sky. But the missing ace faded out of sight. The hero had vanished. But in 1995, the hunt for his body and the attempt to bury him with the honor he deserved began. Frank Dauber is an amateur historian who specializes in tracing missing pilots from World War I. Coming across the name of Adrian Warburton was to change his life.
Well, the first time I came across Wing Commander Warburton, I just happened to pick up a book by the author Tony Spooner. And I picked it up and looking at the portrait of the man, and his name underneath, and all the decorations to him. My first thought was, a photo reconnaissance flyer with all these decorations, you just don't get that. And that's when I decided to read the book thoroughly, at the end of which I was ashamed of myself that, having been a so-called historian for 30-odd years, I'd never heard of Warby.
At about the same time, another amateur historian in Augsburg, southern Germany, was working on his long-term project. Hans Grimminger was in the process of cataloguing downed aircraft from the Second World War in the region where he lived, when he made an intriguing discovery.
One day, it was in the mid-90s, I got microfilms from a friend, from a German archive, with shot-down reports of German anti-aircraft batteries. And suddenly I found a crash place which is not far from our town, Egling. And this crash I didn't have in my register.
But nobody had ever heard of this mystery plane, shot down 150 miles from the target of Warburton's last mission.
Time 11:45. Place, Egling, number of the anti-aircraft unit, type of aircraft, Lightning, in Ordnung means confirmed.
Frank Dauber had a different problem from Hans Grimminger. He knew that Warburton had gone missing on a flight in April 1944, but there was little detail of where or why. He began a wide-scale search of archives all over Europe.
And I blundered on at that stage by making inquiries with the American recon group that he was attached to. For somebody who was so esteemed at that time period, somebody who they accepted as being both infallible and indestructible, nobody seemed to know anything about this last mission. It was a distinct silence.
As Frank Dauber's search for Warburton went cold, Hans Grimminger was trawling through missing aircrew reports from the United States. But curiously, he discovered that the Americans had no missing pilots on that date. It seemed that he was investigating a crashed American aircraft, but not with an American pilot. Hans decided to go to the crash site to try to find out what had happened to the pilot. Had he bailed out? Had he been recovered and given a burial? Or was he still with the plane? Gottfried Grad was 10 years old when the plane crashed near his parents' home.
I heard a strange noise from the plane, so I thought, that's not normal, just flying overhead. But then I looked up, and it came out of the clouds, spiralling down, trailing a plume of smoke behind, and then it crashed. It's sad, but you don't know how to behave when an enemy crashed, or a plane from your own forces. You couldn't really make the distinction when you were 10 years old. What kind of feeling are you meant to have?
Hans Grimminger was now convinced that he'd found an unexcavated war grave.
And because only Warburton was missing at this date, probably in this area, so I had the answer, it must be Warburton.
But when he presented his findings to the Ministry of Defence, he came to a dead end. They had no record of Warburton's last flight and would not accept that the crashed plane was Warburton's.
I sent them a complete crash report with information about the crash site, the circumstances, and nobody asked me. So tell me more about your knowledge about this crash site at Egling.
But the two independent investigations into Warburton's disappearance were about to collide. One of Frank Dorber's many letters looking for help in finding possible crash sites found its way to the archives in Augsburg. It was passed on to Hans Grimminger. Unable to convince the British authorities of his findings, Hans was forced to give up. He contacted Frank Dorber. Frank had no doubt that his 8-year search was now over.
The information that Hans passed over to me was the final piece of the jigsaw. Having spoken with Hans Grimminger about his problems dealing with the British establishment, I realised that this was not going to be straightforward. I seriously wondered if it was going to be possible at all to get him raised.
Convinced he'd solved the 60-year mystery of Warburton's last mission, Frank Dorber contacted the parish priest in Egling to try to get help from the local community.
In rural areas of Germany, the local priest has a lot of political persuasion. I also had the advantage that people in that area had always felt guilty, that they knew an airman was still down there in that field and nobody had done anything about it.
The task of physically pinpointing Warburton's crash site fell to the local historian and archaeologist, Dr. Anton Huber. He found an aerial photograph taken just weeks after the crash. It showed a fresh crater in a field on the edge of the village.
Then I wondered how we could transfer this aerial photograph onto a map at exactly the right scale. That is what we did. Here we can see the crash site precisely. The black dot marks the area.
On the very first day of the excavation, Dr. Huber found parts of an aircraft. First indications were that it was an American plane, so any findings would come under American jurisdiction. David Roth is the director of the US Army Memorial and Mortuary Affairs Division in Europe. His task is to identify US servicemen who have been killed in action. Based in Germany, Roth and his team took the key findings from the crash site back to the laboratory for formal identification.
Okay, these are from the P-38, the crash site up near Egling-on-Par. Done a cursory search in the field, and I've got some notes on it. What I need to do is compare those notes. Essentially, we went through the parts and started documenting them, cataloging them, tracing them back to a P-38. We started looking then and saying, well, this is unusual aircraft because we've got no machine guns here, and primarily its role was a fighter escort airplane. Another critical piece of data that we were able to find in the field came off of the left engine. And this is absolutely critical because what it shows here, and I need you to record this, it's an Allison V1710 engine. This engine was used on P-38 F-5B aircraft. And we'll go back and look in the records. It may be possible that we could associate this engine with the tail number of the aircraft as well. So that's an important piece of information that we've got for this case.
Early on in the excavation, the team made a significant discovery.
There was a large roll of celluloid film that was sitting there. That was consistent with being the roll of film in the correct size that was used in a vertical or oblique or topographical camera.
The evidence that this was a reconnaissance plane was overwhelming. Then came one final vital clue. A piece of rubber was discovered in the excavation. After examination, it turned out to be a flying boot. The pilot hadn't bailed out and had died in the plane. Was the search for the missing ace over at last?
Wo man die zwei Leute am Graben sieht.
Where you can see the two people digging, that was the cockpit area.
Das war für uns der sensibelste Bereich.
That was the most sensitive area for us because we had to find and recover the mortal remains of Adrian Warburton.
Adrian Warburton finden und bergen.
We had an anthropologist from the Central Identification Lab do a review of the skeletal remains, and his report matched up with the physical characteristics of Warburton. We can put him in the right location, in the right airplane, on the right date, at the right time. So one can come to no other conclusion than that it was Adrian Warburton's aircraft.
After 60 years, the mystery was finally solved. But it came too late for Christina. After the war, Christina stayed on Malta. The mystery surrounding Warburton's disappearance had a devastating effect on her life. In the years after the war, she rented a summer house on the north coast of the island.
She used to come to our place, take me out with her swimming. I think she was always longing for company. But I used to hear her talk about this Adrian, how much she loved him. At that time, I didn't know who Adrian was, but now I know who Adrian is.
After Adrian disappeared, Christina spent the rest of her life on Malta. She never married.
I think it was a very sad story because, I mean, loving somebody and waiting for him to come from this mission who went on and he never returned. And then hearing her say to my aunt that she loved him so much that she would never get married. I think it's a very sad story to love somebody and you can't be with him. And then as she grew old, she started drinking a lot. And I think people who drink, it's because they're sad when they drink a lot. Christina Ratcliffe didn't deserve to die this way because she died all alone and with no one to take care of her.
Christina died in 1988. She'd waited 44 years for news of Adrian Warburton.
Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life.
In May 2003, Wing Commander Adrian Warburton was finally laid to rest.
Do please be seated. Today we come to remember Adrian Warburton, who was killed on the 12th of April 1944. A man about whom a great deal could be said. A man who has had films made about him. A man about whom books have been written.